All right. Today we're going to take a look at, are we early to Bitcoin in 2025? Doesn't feel like it to me, but maybe we still are, right? And a lot of people think that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at some data points and look at what some tailwinds are that might lead us to still being early overall to Bitcoin, even if it doesn't quite feel like that when we're in the six-figure range today in 2025. All right, so let's take a look at what we got here. So Bitcoin adoption. So really what we're going to say is, how long will it take from 2025 before we would consider somebody to no longer be an early adopter, okay? And the answer is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years, and it might be actually the next 5 years, okay? And a lot of this is driven, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pull up a chart. We're going to do the Gartner, what's the best chart? Images. All right, the hype cycle. So this right here, this is just an example. We're not going to do anything with this particular data, but this is a typical, well, actually, this is a hype cycle for when something becomes immersion technology. What there also is there's the adoption. I'm going to show you two different things. And there's the adoption curve, okay? And actually, this is the one that we're going to want to pay most attention to. So this is a common theme in that the innovators are the individuals that make up the first 2.5% of the individuals. Once you get to about 13.5% adoption rate, you are still within the early adopters. And once you get over 13.5, let's call it 15%, this is where the early majority, etc. So the question then becomes, what is the current adoption rate for Bitcoin? Because this will answer the question, right? And there was a study that was put out, and this was by River, good resource. Let me see if I can just pull it up. I found this a while ago, but a little bit ago. Let's see, River, world adoption of Bitcoin. They said 4%. Let's just see if this pulls up the article. According to the data, yeah, Bitcoin adoption as of 2025 is only 4% of the world. Blah, blah, blah. So let's operate off this, right? Only 4% of the world adoption holds Bitcoin 2025. Let's operate off of this model right now. So if we go back here, 4%, you're still in the early adopters. Maybe you're not an innovator, but in 2025, let's just say you got in 2025, right? A lot of people got in earlier, but let's say you got in 2025, you're making your first investment. You're still an early adopter, and that is to your benefit, okay? And you're early in the early adopter phase, right? Because we just recently crossed over there. So if we take a look at what this data would tell us is that I believe I've got the data here. So in 2015, okay, the Bitcoin global adoption was 0.1%. So Bitcoin got released in 2009. In the first 6 years, you were very much an innovator. Even in 2015, 6 years after its release, you're still an innovator. In 2020, okay, 2020, this isn't that long ago, 2020, there was 1% adoption, okay? You were an innovator. In 2025, there's 4% adoption. So just recently, in the past year or two, we've moved into the phase in which, and I would argue, one of the biggest things that drove this adoption was actually the introduction of ETFs in 2024. So you can almost argue that there was a threshold that we crossed in 2024, and I think it was late 2024. When was the first? Was it November? First Bitcoin spot ETF date. Let's take a look. Okay. We will launch first Bitcoin ETF in the United States stock air October 19th, 2024. Okay, whatever. This is June. Whatever. In 2024, this occurred, right? And so I would almost argue that you're an innovator if you adopted Bitcoin and started to invest in it before 2024, the first 9 years of its existence. Do I know how to do math? I don't know how to do math. I'm sorry, the first 15 years. Anyways, you were an innovator. Now we're into that early adopters phase, okay? And so if we take a look at the adoption rate was at 1%. Let me pull this over. This is some data points here. I'll pull this over. The adoption rate was 2015 was 0.1%, right? So if we go over to 2020, now we're at 1%. So 4%. So what we're saying here is that there was a 3 or 4, let's just call it a 4x increase from 2020 to 2025. If we continue on this path, the 4x increase gets us to 16% in the next 5 years. So by 2030, that's what it is. So you're going to see a blow-off top coming up in 2025. There'll be another blow-off top in, what would that make it, 2029, okay? That's going to drive people into this asset class. And those numbers, I believe, we will be approaching $1 million per coin in the next cycle. Like, and I know, like, I feel very confident in that, right? Could it happen sooner? Sure. But I feel like we will be getting there, and that is going to really crystallize this for a lot of people that this is a legitimate asset that's here to stay, right? So you are 2024, you're an innovator. 2024 to 2030, let's say 2029, you're an early adopter. And after that, if you haven't gotten on board with Bitcoin by 2030, the boat has sailed. The boat will never be fully gone because you should always be investing in Bitcoin. It's the hardest asset there is. But if you want insanely, if you want 10x to 100x returns within 5 years, now's the time. Okay. So let's look back at some other data here. Here we go. All right. Monetary instability and inflation. So these are some of the tailwinds that we have in our benefit, right? Central bank is going to continue to print money. There's no question about it. That's not going away, right? People are looking for sovereign debts. There's wars, there's weird stuff, there's crazy political stuff, there's all sorts of stuff going on. People are looking for alternative assets. Bitcoin is that answer with that hard cap, right? So let's do some analogies, okay? And yes, we've got financial inclusion, blah, 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 all that great stuff. But let's compare this to the internet, okay? And so what we're looking at here is that mobile phones from the 1980s to 2010, okay? It took that 30 years to reach 50% global adoption, right? So what happened is once we crossed the threshold, right, from 13%, okay? So it took all this time to get to the adoption. But once we crossed 13% in the next decade, it went from 13% to 70%, almost like that. So what you're going to see is once we cross over this 13.5%, let's call it 15%, which should happen in 2030, I think you're going to see this crazy hockey stick. So over the next 5 years, we're going to see, I think, the most unprecedented increase in price, okay, over the next 5 years. And then the 5 years following that is going to be exponential overall adoption. Now, with the price being higher, that I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but you have the ability to technically still front run for the next 5 years. And then the 5 years after that, if you're in there, this is when there's going to be the explosion of this just going from what is email to literally how do I do business or do anything without using email, right? You couldn't imagine that, right? And this is really the process for any adoption curve for anything new, any new technology, anything like that. So we're at this crucial point going from 4% to the 13.5%, 15% coming up here in a short period of time, right? Again, to recap, I believe the era you were an innovator if you invested in Bitcoin prior to the launch of the ETFs. There was more barriers to entry. You had to understand operating on exchanges. You had to understand moving Bitcoin from an exchange to cold storage. You had to know all this stuff. And then when we got the release of spot Bitcoin ETFs, it was simpler. I mean, everybody knows how to purchase a stock or something on their brokerage account. Now that's your option going forward, right? So I do believe that was a tipping point. And then the next one, who knows? Maybe it's going to be overall adoption by the corporations. It's going to be the global adoption by countries and institutions, etc. But it's going to get pretty interesting. So really, that's something to keep track of. Now, the other thing that we're going to want to take a look at are what are some of the signals, right? And some of those signals are on-chain activities, right? So active addresses. How many active addresses do we have? Wallets with non-zero balances. We can get into those in future videos. So not just creating a wallet, but actually putting Bitcoin on there. Entities holding 0.1 BTC or more. Indicates somebody has conviction and is continuing to invest in the asset. HODL waves, exchange outflows. There is a lot going on here that are tailwinds and indications of where we are in those adoption cycles. But at the end of the day, we're still early. It may not feel like it, but when we look at the traditional model, innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, the laggards, this is pretty cool. We still have another 5 years before this thing absolutely takes off from an adoption rate, but I believe the next 5 years are going to be the most asymmetrical increase in price between this blow off top and the 2029 blow off top as well. I think those are going to be absolutely wild. I do see them become more diminishing returns after that, but I think this cycle and the 2029 cycle are going to be pretty exciting and unique. Be an early adopter, get out there, stack some sats, stay sovereign, enjoy.